It's the whole journey of making something which I find the most rewarding. Often when I get to the final piece, that's not the most important thing. It's how I got there. That's what I find exciting. I'm fascinated by objects and things. I collect things. Something will trigger an idea, and I'll work on that and explore that. I like to make things, models or small sculptures or small 3D things, and then I can use those to stimulate drawing, and often paintings come from that. Once I've finished a piece of work, there are certain marks and shapes and patterns or colours on the piece that I like, so I will take that small section of the painting and then use that to start a new piece. I love creating. I get immense joy out of making things. I don't just do painting, I do printmaking and drawing and some installation work and 3D. I'd like to hope that when I make something, it draws people in and they get as much pleasure from it as I did creating it. I've now finished 15 collages, so I'm going to start by just making some charcoal drawings. The background paper that I printed on is from an old technical drawing book. So I love all these exploded views and markings and dimensions and things, and it kind of ties in with the flying manual, my dad's flying manual. I quite like the idea of producing a flying manual of an aircraft that actually doesn't fly or go anywhere. It's taken a long time to settle into a full-time routine of finding out what works best for me. I tend not to get to the studio until mid-morning or around lunchtime, and then I prefer to work through the afternoon and early evenings. A much quieter place to be, and there's less distractions. I can't just come into the studio and get straight onto a piece of work. I have to do lots of other small things, and there's a lot of work for that, so sometimes there's 2 or 3 days spent just preparing surfaces or setting up the printing press or whatever. When I do get into a piece of work, then I just get on and work through. So I was born in Oxford and I grew up just outside Oxford, and I have very fond memories of growing up there. The woodlands were right across the road from our house, and I remember spending hours on my bike walking through the woodlands, and I loved it. I loved being by myself. I was a very timid, very sensitive child. I remember, although I loved primary school, it was a great school creatively, I think. I was, I remember being quite tearful if I had to stand up in front of people. The school was set in a lovely old building, and the conservatory for the old house was turned into an art studio, and I just loved that place. I was very comfortable in there. We had a fantastic art teacher who was very inspirational. I remember doing lots of drawing and paintings of willow trees, because there were lots of willow trees outside our house, and you could climb into the willow trees. So that was quite an inspirational time. I had sort of very poor study skills, but I loved literature, I loved art, was just interested in in science and in all sorts of things. And I never really got it together. Was never very successful at school at all. The only time I was ever really successful was during my art classes. I mean, Oxford is full of fabulous museums. Museum of Natural History, and then adjoining that you have the Pitt Rivers Museum. And as a child, I was always in that museum. And what I loved about the Pitt Rivers Museum especially was that it was full of these wonderful artifacts that are under low level lighting, and there are lots of drawers with these beautiful tags and labels on them written in lovely italic writing. And there is a sense of, when you walk in there is a sort of sense of there's an awareness of your own mortality with all the shrunken heads, and the other striking things were these wonderful boats from the South Pacific there's one huge one that hangs from the ceiling. So as a child I thought it was a flying boat. It's a fantastic place, and for me it was wonderful as a child sort of exploring it. So a lot of that features in my work now. When I was first started teaching, I didn't really come into contact with any artists at all. It was only when I came to Cayman that I was suddenly surrounded by all these people who were painting and exhibiting, and it rekindled things, and that's when I started to sort of paint in earnest, really. I think initially in Cayman, my first few years here, I was struck by the light. It's such a clear, bright light, and it illuminates everything brilliantly. So any colours are quite brilliant, and I was struck by the local architecture, the sort of lovely sort of West Indian homes, and I drew and painted those a lot initially, and I spent a lot of time looking for the more obscure homes tucked away in sort of outlying parts of the island. But I think even then, when I was painting, I wasn't ever really interested in producing something that was a very realistic rendition of what I was seeing. It was much more of an emotional response to what I was seeing, and I think that shows in the sort of the lines and the way that I applied the colours at that time. I moved on from that to wanting to express myself more, and I just think I became more expressive in the way that I painted. Over time, I've now realised that I'm predominantly a landscape painter, because it's the landscape that I'm most interested in, and trying to see the landscape from a different viewpoint. It's also nice to find sort of things in the environment you can pick up and use to draw. So this bit of charcoal I found in a bothy in Scotland, the remains of a charcoal pit, and it's just right for drawing. It's lovely. Research has shown that trees actually communicate with each other, which, as a small boy wandering around in the woods, I used to fantasize about, and that's what I quite liked about being in the woods, in my sort of fantasy world, imagining that all all the trees and plants could communicate. And now it seems that perhaps I wasn't being so fanatical at all. My drawing pens are all handmade as well. Really like drawing with bamboo pens. And we were on holiday in Italy. We stopped by a river and I picked up some bamboo sticks and cut a load for drawing. It's a really nice tool to use. So as I'm making the collages, I'm thinking technically of, you know, moving parts and machinery, and then when I actually come to do the drawings themselves, they seem to be very sort of landscape driven. The trees are back in there again. On reflection of a lot of my landscapes, they're quite they can come across as quite harsh, I think, almost as if the things I'm making, I'm not trying to produce a thing of beauty, but it's almost like an attack on the landscape in a way. I think they can be brutal sometimes, the landscapes, which I find a bit sort of surprising, really, considering it's, you know, the landscapes as something that I always felt that I could turn to as a sort of a place for escape and sort of being by myself and you know, retreating from home, going out into the open space. But I think the way I see the landscape is to do with me growing up as a child, you know, this sensitive, maybe over-anxious child, at times a very unhappy one. But when I was out in the woodland, in the forest, I loved being there. It was peace of mind. I still today kind of treat the trees as though they are, you know, watching me or monitoring me, and you know, they're as silent monitors, you know, taking care of me, or you know, I don't see it as I don't see woodlands as a, you know, a sinister place. I find them a very calming, relaxing place to be in. But lately I've been drawn much more to focusing on where I've come from. So, you know, growing up in Oxford, so I'm being much more drawn towards the landscapes of Oxford recently, well, in the last couple of years, particularly the trees at Whitnam Clumps. And of course, when I started looking at the Whitnam Clumps and as a research, and the more I realised, I seem to have this feeling that I have ownership of these places. So I was quite disappointed to hear that Paul Nash has already been there and painted them. I loved flying when I was a child. I'm fascinated with the idea of these, you know, these big aircraft getting up into the sky, being able to fly around. I want to look at the landscape from a different viewpoint than just at ground level. I like this idea of a kind of a bird's eye view too, you know, how birds have this ability to zoom in from a great height and look at things in detail, and that's what I'm trying to do with my paintings. I have favourite spots in Oxfordshire where I grew up, and I like to zoom in and zoom out and fly around, and also, you know, this idea of developing an imaginary flying machine is a great vehicle for allowing me to be able to fly over these landscapes in a physical structure which obviously I can't fly, and it wouldn't ever fly, but in a way it's it's transporting me and my kind of dreams and visions of the landscape. It transports me to wherever I want to go, really.
Honig van lage van ween is ruggen van je van lach, dimmigen van je hinnen was, kan hoor ich genacht. Hen ruanishki han rievach is en biogala huos na vel igual ma guardo sargion ik shenem na von saner